No one expected the high school's biggest night of the year to end in silence. The fall festival was supposed to be all cotton candy, marching bands, and the glow of Friday night lights. But when 17-year-old Emily Carter disappeared in the middle of it all, while the Ferris wheel spun and the crowd cheered, it ripped a hole in the heart of the town. And the only one who seemed to know where to look was a German shepherd named Shadow. The night of the Maple Ridge High School Fall Festival had started like any other small-town tradition. The crisp bite of October air mixed with the smell of kettle corn and grill burgers. Parents sat wrapped in blankets on the bleachers, while the football team warmed up under the floodlights. Teenagers in Letterman jackets clustered near the food stalls, trying to look cooler than they felt. Younger kids darted between carnival games, their faces sticky with caramel apples. Emily Carter should have been one of them. Her friend said she was last seen near the ticket booth, laughing, her dark hair spilling out a hoodie. But when the music faded and the final whistle blew, Emily was gone. No one saw her leave. No one saw who she was with. By the time her parents realized she wasn't answering her phone, the festival had dissolved into chaos. Officer Ryan Hale was already patrolling the grounds with his K-9 partner, Shadow, when the call came in over the radio. Hale was 37, a former Marine turned small-town cop, with a reputation for being calm under pressure. Shadow, his 3-year-old German shepherd, was trained to track narcotics and missing persons. The dog's instincts had saved lives before, and tonight, Ryan prayed they would again. He found Emily's mother near the bleachers, face pale, arms crossed tight like she was holding herself together. "She was right here," Mrs. Carter said, pointing toward the food stalls. Her voice shook. "I looked away for 2 minutes, and she was just gone." Ryan crouched down beside Shadow, resting a hand on the dog's back. "We'll find her," he said firmly, more for the mother's sake than his own. Shadow's good at this. Shadow's ears twitched at the mention of his name. The dog was already restless, pulling slightly against the leash, nose twitching at the night air. Ryan gave the command, "Seek." The shepherd lowered his muzzle to the ground and moved forward, weaving through the thinning crowd. People stepped aside as they saw the dog working, some whispering nervously, others watching with desperate hope. At first, the trail was faint. Emily's scent was mixed with fried food, spilled soda, and hundreds of other students' perfume and cologne. But Shadow was relentless. His nails clicked against the asphalt as he pulled Ryan past the Ferris wheel, toward the edge of the football field where the lights didn't quite reach. The further they went, the quieter became. The laughter and music from the festival faded into the background, replaced by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant creak of the stadium bleachers. Ryan's chest tightened. This was too far from the heart of the festival, too secluded. Shadow stopped abruptly at the old locker room, an abandoned building behind the football field, boarded up for years after mold had made it unsafe. No one used it anymore. At least, no one was supposed to. Ryan frowned. "What is it, boy?" Shadow sniffed along the doorframe, then pawed at the base of the door, claws scraping against rotted wood. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ryan tried the handle. Locked. He signaled for another officer, then gave the order to force it open. The metal latch groaned as it broke, and the door swung inward with a cloud of dust. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, thick with mildew. Broken lockers leaned against the walls, their doors hanging loose like crooked teeth. A single flickering bulb buzzed overhead, casting long, nervous shadows. Shadow moved without hesitation, his nose dragging along the cracked linoleum floor. Ryan followed closely, flashlights sweeping across the room. It looked like no one had stepped foot in here for years. But then, a sharp bark from Shadow. Ryan dropped to his knees where the dog stood, pawing at the corner of a rusted bench. At first, he thought it was just grime, but when he shone the light closer, his stomach sank. It was blood, just a drop. Fresh. Ryan's jaw clenched. He didn't want to believe what the evidence suggested, but training told him otherwise. Emily had been here, and whatever happened wasn't good. Halfway through the search, as more officers spread out around the property, Ryan caught his breath and looked back at the crowd forming outside the caution tape. Parents clutching their kids tighter. Students scrolling their phones for updates. Strangers whispering theories already too wild to be true. This is where moments like these matter, where stories can either fade into rumors or lead to answers. If you're following along right now, take a moment to subscribe. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss where this case leads next. Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked. He barked sharply, not at the bloodstain this time, but toward the far corner of the locker room. Ryan turned the flashlight, heart thumping. Behind a row of dented lockers, the wall looked wrong. The paint was peeling in uneven patches, as if someone had moved the metal units recently. "Show me," Ryan whispered. The shepherd lunged forward, pawing frantically at the base of the lockers until dust rose in clouds. With the help of another officer, Ryan shoved one of the units aside, revealing a narrow gap in the wall. It wasn't wide enough to be a doorway, but there was a draft. Cold air spilled through the crack. Ryan leaned closer and caught it, the faintest smell of gasoline mixed with earth. Shadow growled again, low and steady, as if warning Ryan, "Whatever's behind here isn't safe." Ryan straightened. "We'll need tools. This wall isn't solid. Someone's been in and out of here." The other officer nodded, already calling it in, but Ryan didn't move his hand from Shadow's harness, because in that moment he realized something else. The drop of blood wasn't random. The lockers weren't random. Emily's disappearance wasn't random. Someone had led her here. The night stretched on. Search teams fanned across the football field and into the woods beyond. Helicopters circled with spotlights. Reporters began to gather at the police line, their vans spilling cables across the wet grass. The entire town was awake now, caught between disbelief and dread. Ryan stayed with Shadow, retracing the dog steps, replaying every detail in his head. Emily's mother's face, the scuffed dirt near the bleachers, the way Shadow had zeroed in on the locker room without hesitation. There was a story here, one that didn't fit the easy explanations, like a runaway or a prank. And Shadow, with his unerring nose and instincts, was the only one writing it in real time. Ryan knew better than anyone. Dogs don't lie. By 3 a.m., the festival grounds looked like a crime scene. Floodlights bathed the bleachers in white, and the Ferris wheel spun slowly in the distance, eerily empty. Officers moved in and out of the old locker room, carrying bags of potential evidence. Ryan stood near the door, Shadow pressed against his leg, both of them exhausted but alert. His mind was racing with questions he didn't dare speak aloud. Why would someone bring Emily here? How did they know no one would notice in the chaos of the festival? And what exactly was hidden behind that wall? He glanced down at Shadow. The dog's ears were still forward, body tense, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the locker room, as if waiting, as if daring whatever was out there to reveal itself. Ryan tightened his grip on the leash. "We'll find her," he muttered, almost like a promise. "We have to." Shadow didn't look up. He didn't need to. His whole body was already committed to the hunt. And as the first streaks of dawn painted the horizon, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a missing girl anymore. The locker room had secrets, and Shadow was the only one who knew how to unlock them. The locker room was sealed off by sunrise. Yellow police tape stretched across the doors like a scar. The air smelled of mildew, copper, and unease. Even as officers carried out boxes of old equipment and dust-covered papers, it felt less like a forgotten building and more like a trap, like someone had meant for Emily Carter's trail to end here. But Shadow hadn't stopped. Ryan Hale knew his partner well enough to recognize the restless pacing, the low grumble deep in the shepherd's chest, the way Shadow's nose kept drifting back toward the cracked wall at the rear of the locker room. It was more than curiosity. The dog was telling them the story wasn't finished. Ryan crouched, rubbing the shepherd's flank. "You're not letting this go, huh?" Shadow's ears flicked, but his gaze stayed pinned to the corner. One of the younger officers, Patel, barely a year out of the academy, shifted uneasily. "Sir, the building inspector said that wall could come down. Looks like it was patched up years ago. Maybe something's behind it." Ryan exhaled. His gut agreed. "Then we'll bring it down carefully. I don't want us crushing whatever's back there." The team worked in silence, hammers striking plaster until the wall cracked open. Dust poured out like the building itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. And when the last chunk gave way, the beam of Ryan's flashlight fell into a dark, narrow passage. The smell hit him first. Stale air, damp concrete, and something faintly metallic. Shadow growled, the sound reverberating in the hollow space. "Shadow first," Ryan said. It wasn't a question. The shepherd slipped into the passage with the confidence of a soldier, nails clicking softly against the floor. His body was tense but steady, moving as though he'd trained for this exact corridor. Ryan followed, ducking under the broken edges of the wall, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The passage led deeper beneath the bleachers, the ceiling low enough to force Ryan into a crouch. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of boots, the drip of unseen water, the dog's steady breathing. "Looks like an old utility tunnel," Patel whispered behind him. "Why would anyone?" Ryan raised a hand. Silence. Shadow had stopped, his tail stiff, ears forward, nose hovering inches from the ground. He whined softly, then pawed at a patch of dust. Ryan bent down and swept the beam across it. A silver chain, delicate, broken at the clasp. Ryan picked it up, holding in the light. "Bracelet," he muttered. "Matches the one Emily wore in her school photo." Patel's face paled. Shadow barked once, sharp and insistent, then lunged forward, pulling hard against the leash. The tunnel widened ahead, splitting into two paths. Ryan's pulse quickened. One trail led deeper toward the boiler room. The other curved upward, toward the heart of the school. Shadow stopped at the fork, nose twitching rapidly. For a tense moment, he seemed to war between two invisible threads of scent. Then, with a decisive bark, he veered left, downward. Ryan swallowed hard. "All right, we follow." The tunnel spat them out into a forgotten equipment room. Rusted weight benches leaned against the wall, and a film of dust coated the floor. But the strangest part wasn't the neglect. It was the writing. On the far wall, scrawled in chalk, were words. "She shouldn't have found out." Patel muttered under his breath, "Jesus." Ryan's chest tightened. This wasn't kids playing around. This was intentional. Someone had left a message. And if Emily had stumbled into this place, someone had wanted to remind her she didn't belong. Shadow growled low, circling the room. He stopped suddenly at a vent along the wall, nose pressed to the grate. Ryan knelt beside him, shining his flashlight. The faint odor of gasoline trickled through. Ryan's stomach turned. Why the hell would there be gas in the ventilation? Before Patel could answer, a sound echoed through the ceiling. A heavy footstep. Then another. Someone was upstairs. Ryan motioned Patel to kill his flashlight. The room plunged into near darkness, lit only by thin slats of moonlight sneaking through cracks. Shadow went silent but alert, ears tracking the movement above. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. Ryan's radio crackled to life, startling both men. Unit 4 to command. We're sweeping the east hallway. No sign of... Static swallowed the rest. Ryan swore under his breath. He tried to respond, but all he got was more static. Either interference or someone was jamming the frequency. The footsteps stopped. Shadow's hackles rose. He let out a quiet, warning bark. Ryan whispered, "We're not alone down here." By the time they climbed back to the main hallway of the school, the building was empty. Lockers lined the walls, their paint chipped, the smell of floor wax faint beneath years of disuse. The festival grounds outside were silent now, stripped bare of lights and laughter. But Shadow didn't slow. His nose dragged him past trophy cases and faded banners, toward the east wing no one used anymore. Ryan's flashlight cut across graffiti, broken tiles, and water stains that looked like shadows frozen in place. At the end of the hall, Shadow stopped again, his paw pressed against a classroom door. Ryan turned the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the desks were overturned, paper scattered as if the room had been abandoned mid-lesson. On the chalkboard, faint words lingered. Property of Maple Ridge Unified, 1983. But it wasn't the desks or the chalkboard that made Ryan's chest clench. It was the floor. Scuffed. Drag marks. Faint but visible in the dust. Something heavy had been moved recently. Shadow sniffed along the marks, nose pressing to ground, tail wagging once in sharp confirmation. He followed the drag trail to the far corner where a rug lay crumpled. Ryan pulled it back and found a trapdoor recessed into the floor. Patel whispered, "This isn't in the building plans." Ryan didn't look up. He already knew. Whoever had taken Emily didn't just use abandoned spaces. They had designed them. Ryan called for backup, but the static still hissed through his radio. He clenched his jaw. He had two choices: wait and risk losing the trail, or trust Shadow and move now. The shepherd made the decision for him. Pawing at the trapdoor, growled deep in his chest. Ryan pushed the door open. A cold draft rushed upward, carried with the smell of damp stone and something else. Faint but undeniable. Fear. Shadow slipped down the ladder first, Ryan right behind him. The chamber below was small, concrete walls sweating moisture. Broken shelves leaned against one wall, but it was what sat in the center that froze Ryan in place. A chair, metal, bolted to the floor. On the ground beside it, a scrap of fabric, bright red. Patel whispered, "Sir." Emily was wearing a red hoodie. Ryan's throat tightened. He crouched, holding the fabric gently. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm Emily had been here. Shadow barked suddenly, sharp and furious, his whole body pivoting toward the far corner. Ryan swung his flashlight, and there it was, a camera, mounted high, small, with a blinking red light. Someone was watching. The chamber seemed to shrink around him. Ryan felt the weight of unseen eyes, the knowledge that every move they made had already been observed. He yanked Patel back toward the ladder. "We're leaving. Now." Shadow backed up with them, but his gaze never wavered from that red light. By the time they reached the surface, Ryan's pulse was hammering. He locked the classroom door behind them, forcing himself to breathe. "Sir, what do we tell the others?" Patel asked, voice shaking. Ryan shook his head. "Nothing. Not yet. We don't know who's listening." Shadow pressed against his leg, steady and solid, the only constant in a night that was unraveling fast. Ryan looked down at him, hand brushing the shepherd harness. "We'll find her," he whispered again, more to himself than anyone else. "But whoever did this, they're already ahead of us." The first light of dawn crept through the school windows, washing the empty hallways in pale gray. Outside, news vans lined the street, their cameras hungry for answers Ryan didn't have. But Shadow wasn't finished. Even as Ryan guided him back to the main entrance, the shepherd pulled once more, nose low, muscles tense. Ryan sighed, exhaustion clawing at him. "Where now, boy?" Shadow stopped at the double doors, leading to the gymnasium. His bark echoed through the hollow building, sharp and unrelenting. Ryan pushed the doors open. The gym was vast, empty, the polished floor gleaming faintly. Banners hung limp from the rafters, proclaiming championships long forgotten. And there, at the center of the court, was something that didn't belong. A smear, dark, almost invisible against the wood. Blood. The smear on the gym floor was no larger than a handprint, but in the middle of that vast, echoing space, it felt enormous. A reminder that violence had happened here, quiet, deliberate, and hidden in plain sight. Ryan Hale crouched beside the stain, running his flashlight beam across it. Dry but recent. The wood beneath was scratched too, like something or someone had been dragged. Shadows circled tight around him, nose brushing the floor, tail stiff. He barked once, sharply, then pawed at the smear, tracing it toward the east corner of the gym. Ryan followed the line. It ended at a door. Small, metal, paint chipped from years of neglect. The kind of door kids whisper about during late-night basketball games. Nobody used it anymore. It led nowhere, at least that's what people said. "Of course," Ryan muttered. "The one door no one opens." Patel hovered behind him, voice tight. "You think she's—" "Don't finish that." Ryan snapped, sharper than he meant. He straightened, tugging Shadow back a step. "We don't think. We follow the dog." The door groaned when he pulled it, as though resisting. Inside, a narrow staircase plunged downward. The smell was immediate and foul, damp concrete, rot, and something chemical Ryan couldn't quite place. Shadow didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, nose to the ground, leash straining. Ryan tightened his grip and started down the steps, the beam of his flashlight cutting through cobwebs. The staircase ended in a storage room. Old mats leaned against the walls, their vinyl peeling. Rusted folding chairs were stacked high in the corner. But all of it looked untouched for years, except one thing. A single chair sat in the center of the room, different from the rest. Metal legs polished. Fresh scrape marks beneath it on the concrete. Ryan's chest tightened. He swept the light around. The walls told the real story. Scratches, dozens of them, carved into concrete. Some shallow, some deep, random at first glance. But when Ryan leaned closer, he saw patterns, numbers, initials, maybe even words, though most had been worn down. Patel whispered, "Sir, this looks like—" "I know what it looks like," Ryan cut in. He didn't want to say the word. Not yet. Shadow barked furiously, claws scraping against the far wall. Ryan rushed over and saw it. A vent, just like in the other chamber. This one was broken open. Faint traces of cloth caught in the jagged edge. Red threads. Ryan's stomach dropped. Emily's hoodie. For a moment, the room spun with the weight of it. He pressed a hand to the wall to steady himself. He'd worked missing person cases before, but never one that twisted to the very heart of town. Never one that dragged him into places kids grew up walking past every day. Shadow growled again, low and steady, pulling Ryan back to the moment. The shepherd wasn't giving up. His whole body vibrated with focus, as though Emily's scent was woven into his nerves. Ryan crouched beside him. "Find her, Shadow." "Show me." The dog barked, then shoved his nose against the cracked vent. He whined, pacing, then scratched at the floor beside it. Ryan clicked his radio again. Static buzzing back. No connection. Whoever had built these spaces had thought of everything. How to stay hidden. How to stay silent. Patel shifted nervously, scanning the room. "Sir, we should wait for backup. This feels wrong." Ryan shook his head. "If we wait, we lose her trail. And she doesn't have that kind of time." Shadow barked again, the sound echoing off concrete. The dog pressed his shoulder against the vent, as though trying to force it wider. Ryan leaned in, shining his flashlight deeper. That's when he saw it. Not another tunnel this time, but a crawl space, just wide enough for a teenager to be shoved through. The vent opened into darkness. The smell stronger now. Gasoline, sweat, fear. Ryan tried to push the metal aside, but it was wedged tight. Shadow whined, teeth scraping against the grate. "Not here," Ryan murmured. "We'll find another way." He stood and scanned the ceiling. Pipes snaked across, most rusted, some dripping. But one section looked newer, replaced, patched. It ran along the wall and disappeared into the concrete, right above the vent. Ryan's instinct screamed. Someone had reinforced this room. Someone had built it for a reason. He turned to Patel. "Mark this place. Nobody comes down here without my say." Patel nodded, too quickly, eager to leave. But Shadow resisted. The shepherd wouldn't move from the vent, body pressed low, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. Ryan knelt and pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's. "I know, boy. We'll come back. I promise." When they emerged from the staircase, the gym felt different, larger, emptier. Ryan could almost hear the echoes of a basketball game long past. Sneakers squeaking, whistles blowing. It struck him how easily evil could hide in ordinary places. As he stepped into the hallway, a faint metallic clang echoed from somewhere ahead. Ryan froze. Shadow's ears shot up, his body stiff as a drawn bowstring. The sound came again. A door shutting. Deliberate. Slow. Ryan raised his flashlight. "Hello?" No answer. Shadow growled, low and deep, teeth bared. Ryan's voice hardened. "Who's there?" Still nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, a laugh. Soft, mocking. It came from the far end of the hall, just beyond the flicker of his light. Ryan broke into a run, shadows surging ahead. Patel scrambled to keep up. But when they reached the end, the hallway was empty. Only the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Ryan swore, slamming his hand against the lockers. They were being watched, played with, Shadow sniffed furiously, tracing the scent, but it faded near the exit doors. Whoever had been there was gone. Patel's face was pale. "Sir, what if it's not just one person?" Ryan didn't answer. He didn't want to give that fear a voice. Instead, he turned back toward the gym. "We go over everything again, every inch. If Emily was here, we'll find more." Hours later, as the sun climbed higher, the school was crawling with investigators. Crime scene tape stretched across hallways. Evidence markers dotted the floor. But Ryan stayed near the gym, refusing to leave Shadow's side. The dog was restless, pacing, circling back to the vent again and again as though daring Ryan to ignore it. And maybe that was the point. The vent wasn't just a hiding place. It was a message, a taunt. Ryan scribbled notes in his pad, his handwriting sharp with frustration. Bracelet, fabric scrap, blood, scratches on walls. Camera, vent, always a vent. Patterns, always patterns. Shadow barked once, sharp, pulling him back to present. The shepherd had wandered to the bleachers this time, nose pressed against the wood. Ryan followed, shining his light. There, wedged in the crack of the seating, was something small. He pulled it free carefully. A phone, cracked screen, mud smeared across the case. He pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. A background photo of Emily and her friends at the fair, smiling, faces blurred by motion. But it wasn't the photo that made Ryan's chest clench. It was the notification bar. One unread message. He tapped it open. She wasn't supposed to see this. Ryan's vision narrowed. His hand clenched tight around the phone. He felt Shadow's weight press against his leg, steady, grounding him. This wasn't random. This wasn't a runaway. Emily had seen something. Something someone wanted buried deep. And now Ryan knew. Finding her wasn't just about saving a missing girl. It was about uncovering what the town had spent years pretending wasn't there. Shadow whined softly, nose pressed to the phone. His eyes met Ryan's, steady and unflinching. Ryan whispered, "You're right, boy. This isn't about what she saw. It's about who made sure she couldn't tell." The shepherd wagged his tail once, sharp, ready for the fight ahead. And Ryan Hale, exhausted but relentless, realized the case had just crossed a line. They weren't chasing shadows anymore. They were being hunted by them. The cracked phone felt heavier in Ryan Hale's hand than any weapon he had ever carried. It wasn't just evidence. It was proof. Proof that Emily hadn't run away. Proof that someone had planned every inch of this nightmare. The words burned on the screen. She wasn't supposed to see this. Beside him, Shadow shifted restlessly, nose pressed to the phone case as if the shepherd could pull a trail out of static and glass. His tail flicked once, sharply. Then he jerked his head toward the vent at the far end of the gym. The same vent he hadn't stopped pacing back to all morning. Ryan shoved the phone into an evidence bag, sealing it tight. His voice was low, steady, more for Shadow than Patel, who hovered pale and wide-eyed nearby. "All right, boy, show me where she went." The dog barked once, sharp and decisive, then lunged toward the vent. His claws raked the wood floor, muscles straining as though the path beyond was the only thing that mattered. Ryan's gut twisted. That crawl space hadn't been built for rescue. It had been built for secrets. But Shadow didn't care about design or intent. He cared about Emily. And Ryan had promised the Carters he would bring her home. They pulled maintenance blueprints for Maple Ridge High from the city archives by noon. Dusty rolls of yellowed paper were spread across the hood of a patrol car outside the school. Ryan traced the lines of finger, eyes narrowing. "There," he muttered. The gym vents connect to a network of crawl spaces. Half of these tunnels were sealed in the 80s after asbestos testing, but not all of them. Patel frowned. So someone could move through them, undetected. Not just someone. Ryan tapped the spot behind the gym. A lot of someones. For years. He didn't say what he was thinking. That this wasn't about Emily alone. That maybe it had never been. Shadow whined, nudging Ryan's arm impatiently. His nose pressed against the edge of the blueprint, right over a shaded section marked storage access, sub-level. Ryan rubbed the shepherd's ear. "Yeah, I see it too. Guess we're going back in." The return to the locker room felt heavier this time. every creak of the building like a warning. Officers had set up floodlights, but the shadows seemed thicker, curling against the corners like smoke. Shadow moved ahead, tail rigid, body language screaming urgency. He dragged Ryan back to the vent, nails scratching the concrete as he pawed at it. Ryan knelt, flashlight beam cutting into the crawl space. Too tight for you, buddy. He hesitated, glancing at Patel. But maybe not for me. Patel's eyes widened. Sir, that's insane. You don't know where it leads. It could collapse. Ryan cut him off. Emily's out there. Shadow says this is the way. That's enough for me. Before Patel could argue, Ryan holstered his radio, clipped a flashlight to his vest, and crawled in. The vent scraped against his shoulders, the air growing colder and damper with every inch. Dust clung to his throat. Behind him, Shadow barked once, sharp and commanding, then paced to the opening like a sentry refusing to leave his post. The crawl space stretched longer than Ryan expected, the beam of his light catching rusted pipes and graffiti scrawled in chalk. Help me. 1987. Not safe. Ryan's chest tightened. Kids had been down here before. Long before Emily. At last, the tunnel widened, spitting him into a low chamber. His flashlight swept across broken desks, tattered banners, and a smell that twisted his stomach. Stale gasoline and mildew layered over something metallic. In the corner, a cardboard box sat half-crushed. Inside, school records, rosters, photos, faded files stamped with district seals. Ryan picked one up, flipping it open. A ledger of students from 1985, margins marked with red ink, notes that didn't belong in any official file. Expelled quietly. Sent away. Keep quiet. His pulse hammered. Whatever Emily had seen, it was tied to this. A sudden noise jolted him. The faint scrape of metal against metal. He swung the flashlight. Nothing. Only the hollow echo of his own breathing. Then he felt it. A breeze. He followed it to the back wall where the concrete looked uneven, patched poorly. He pressed his hand against it. Hollow. Ryan leaned close, listening, and froze. Voices. Faint. Mayo. Talking just beyond the wall. The sudden bark that ripped through the crawl space nearly made Ryan drop his light. Shadow's voice, echoing sharp and furious from the locker room vent, warning him. Ryan scrambled back through the tunnel, heart pounding. By the time he crawled out, Shadow was bristling, teeth bared, barking toward the far end of the locker room. Footsteps thundered overhead. The slam of a door. Ryan pulled his weapon, sweeping the light. Who's here? Only silence answered. Patel burst in, breathless. Sir, East Wing cameras just went dark. All of them. Ryan swore. Someone knew exactly where they were. Someone who didn't want them finding the chamber. Shadow barked again, this time not with anger but urgency. He bolted toward the hallway, dragging Ryan with him. The shepherd led them through the east corridor, paws pounding against tile. He skidded to a stop at a janitor's closet, growling low. Ryan yanked the door open. Inside was nothing but shelves stacked with cleaner bottles and old mops. But Shadow shoved his nose against the back wall, whining, pawing frantically. Ryan pushed the shelves aside. A narrow door revealed itself, hidden flush with the wall. No knob, just a keyhole. Patel whispered, "This isn't on the blueprints." Ryan's flashlight beam flicked over the frame. New hinges, recently oiled. Shadow barked, sharp and insistent. Ryan exhaled. Get bolt cutters. Now! It took 2 minutes to break through. The hidden door creaked open, revealing another staircase plunging into the dark. The smell hit them again, gasoline, damp earth, and something else. Ryan. Shadow surged forward, dragging Ryan down the stairs. His hackles were raised, his body thrumming with intensity. He wasn't just following a scent. He was chasing life. The stairwell ended at another chamber, larger this time. Ryan's beam swept across walls covered in more scratches, more desperate messages. But what froze him wasn't the writing. It was a sound, a chain rattling. Faint. Human. Ryan's chest tightened. He crouched, whispering. Emily? Silence. Then, so faint he wondered if he imagined it, A whimper. Patel's breath hitched. "Sir, it's her." Ryan raised a hand, cutting him off. "No sudden moves. If she's here, someone left her here." Shadow's body stiffened, nose pressed to the far corner. He barked once, sharp, then whined, scratching at the floor. Ryan followed the dog's lead, flashlight sweeping the corner. There it was, another trapdoor, this one reinforced with steel. Fresh locks glinted against the beam. Ryan's stomach dropped. Whoever had built this hadn't just hidden someone. They had caged them. He tugged at the lock, fury burning in his chest. "Damn it!" Shadow barked furiously, claws scraping against the steel. His whole body trembled with urgency. Patel whispered, voice trembling, "Sir, what if we're too late?" Ryan didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep in the silence, beneath the dog's frantic barking and his own hammering pulse, he heard it again. A cry, faint, broken, but alive. Ryan pressed his forehead against the cold steel, his voice raw. "Hold on, Emily. We're coming. I swear we're coming." Shadow barked once, loud and unrelenting, as though sealing the promise. And in that moment, Ryan knew this wasn't just a search anymore. It was a race. A race against whoever had built these paths, against the secrets buried in the walls of Maple Ridge High, against the shadows that haunted his town for decades. And Shadow, the dog who never gave up, never lied, never looked away, was leading the charge. The cry was faint, but it cut through Ryan Hale's chest like a blade. In all his years on the force, he trained himself to separate noise from evidence, rumor from fact. But this wasn't a sound his mind invented. It was real. A girl's cry. Emily Carter's cry. Shadow pressed his body against a steel trapdoor, nails raking furiously, barking in a rhythm that felt like desperation and command rolled into one. "She's here. She's alive. Do something." Ryan dropped to his knees, hands on the cold steel. "Emily, can you hear me?" Another whimper, muffled, broken, but unmistakable. Patel's eyes went wide. "We need cutters. A team. We need—" "No time," Ryan snapped. His voice shook despite the hard edge. He yanked at the lock again, fury boiling. "They'll move her if they know we're close." Shadow barked sharply, echoing in the hollow chamber. Ryan looked at him, the shepherd's amber eyes steady, burning with the kind of clarity no human could match. He made his decision. Within 20 minutes, 2 more officers arrived, dragging equipment, bolt cutters, crowbars, even a portable saw. The chamber filled with the screech of metal biting metal, sparks showering as the locks gave way one by one. Ryan knelt close, speaking through the steel. "Emily, hang on. We're coming. Don't give up." No response this time. His stomach clenched. Shadow whined, ears flat, pacing in circles. The shepherd pressed against Ryan's side, then lunged back to the trapdoor, barking with raw insistence. At last, the final lock snapped. 2 officers pried the trap open, muscles straining. It groaned and gave, revealing a narrow set of steps spiraling downward into darkness. The smell rolled out first, stale air mixed with sweat and gasoline. Ryan raised his flashlight. "I'm going down first. Shadow with me." Patel started to protest, but one look from Ryan silenced him. The steps creaked under their weight, every sound magnified in the suffocating silence. At the bottom lay another chamber, this one smaller, walls lined with cinder block. Shadow moved ahead, tail stiff, ears pricked. He whined once, then lowered his nose to the ground, following a trail invisible to anyone but him. And there, huddled in the far corner, was Emily. Her wrists were bound, her hoodie torn, her face pale beneath a film of dust. Her eyes flinched against the flashlight beam, wide with fear. Ryan's breath caught. Relief and rage collided in his chest. "Emily," she whimpered again, flinching back as if expecting punishment instead of rescue. Ryan crouched, lowering his voice. "It's okay. You're safe now. We're with the police. We're here to take you home." Shadow crept closer, body low, tail wagging just slightly, ears softening. He pressed his nose gently against Emily's hand. For the first time, her shoulders loosened. A sob broke free. Ryan's throat tightened. "That's right. He's a good boy. He found you. They cut the bindings quickly, Patel murmuring reassurances while Ryan kept his flashlight trained on the walls, instinct screaming they weren't alone. Emily leaned heavily against him as he lifted her to her feet. Her voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. They said, I wasn't supposed to see it. Ryan stiffened. See what? But Emily's eyes darted to the shadows in the corners of the chamber. They're watching. Before Ryan could press further, Shadow growled. Low. Warning. The shepherd's gaze locked on the camera bolted high above the ceiling beam. Its red light blinked steadily, recording everything. Ryan swore. We're compromised. Move now. The climb out was frantic. Emily stumbled, but Ryan held her steady, Shadow never leaving her side. By the time they reached the surface, officers were shouting into radios, voices tight with adrenaline. But the radios crackled only static. Patel's face drained. Sir, the whole building's dead. Comms are out everywhere. Ryan cursed under his breath. Whoever was behind this had killed their signal again. He shoved Emily toward Patel. Get her out. Straight to the medic van. Don't stop. Don't talk to anyone. Just move. Patel nodded, looping an arm around the trembling girl. But Shadow didn't follow. The shepherd stayed rooted at the trapdoor, ears straining, nose twitching. He barked once, low and sharp, like he caught something no one else had. Ryan crouched. What is it, boy? Shadow pawed at the trapdoor again, whining, then turned his gaze toward the far wall of the gym. His whole body vibrated with urgency. Ryan's got twisted. Emily wasn't the only secret hidden here. Outside, the scene was chaos. Reporters screaming questions, parents crying, officers shoving back the crowd. But Ryan barely heard them. His eyes stayed on Shadow, who tugged relentlessly toward the east wing. Not done yet, huh? Ryan murmured. The shepherd's only answer was another bark. Ryan followed. The trail led them deeper into the school, past taped-off classrooms and flickering lights. Shadow moved faster now, nails clacking against tile, nose locked on the ground. At the end of the hall, he stopped, not at a vent this time, not at a trapdoor, but at a classroom door. Ryan frowned. The sign above read Room 112, History. Shadow barked once, pawed at the door, then looked back at Ryan with sharp insistence. Ryan turned the handle. Unlocked. Inside, dust motes floated in the flashlight beam. Desks sat in neat rows, untouched for years. But the chalkboard was different. Fresh writing. She isn't the first. Ryan's heart slammed. His gaze shot to Shadow, who growled low, nose dragging along the floor until he stopped at the teacher's desk. The shepherd sniffed, barked once, then clawed at the floor. Ryan moved the desk aside. Beneath it, a panel of loose tiles. He pried them up. A hole gaped beneath, dark and narrow. Patel's voice cracked behind him. Sir, how many? Ryan cut him off. We don't know. Not yet. He looked at Shadow, who was already poised at the edge, ears forward, eyes steady. The shepherd was ready. Always ready. Ryan swallowed hard. All right, boy. Let's finish what we started. They lowered into the darkness again, the air growing colder, heavier. The tunnel beneath Room 112 felt different from the others. Less like storage, more like design. The walls were smoother, the floor cleaner, almost intentional. Shadow's nose twitched rapidly, his body tense. He stopped suddenly, paw pressing against a mark on the wall. Ryan shone the light. Scratches again. But these weren't random. They formed a name. Hannah, 1992. Ryan's throat went dry. Hannah Rivers. She'd disappeared during Ryan's freshman year. Everyone said she'd run away. Shadow barked sharply, pulling them onward. The tunnel forked again. Left led toward the boiler room. Right curved deeper under the east wing. Ryan whispered, which way, boy? Shadow sniffed both paths, then barked decisively and veered right. The tunnel ended at a heavy door, steel reinforced, identical to the one Emily had been locked behind. But this one was different. There were no locks, no chains, just a sign nailed crudely across the center. Keep out, property of Maple Ridge. Ryan's pulse hammered. His hand brushed Shadow's harness. On 3, boy. He shoved the door. It swung open easily. The flashlight beam swept across a chamber larger than any before. Walls lined with filing cabinets. Boxes stacked high. And in the center, a table. On it, a spread of photos. Students. Decades worth. Every face labeled. Some crossed out. And at the end of the row, Emily's. Ryan staggered back. His light trembled in his grip. Shadow barked, furious. Teeth bared at the table as if it embodied every evil in the room. Ryan whispered, barely able to breathe, "This isn't just about her. This goes back years." Patel's voice was barely audible. "Sir, how many kids?" Ryan didn't answer. Couldn't, because the truth sat there in front of him, undeniable. And he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Shadow growled low, steady, his body a wall of muscle and resolve. Ryan pressed a hand against his partner's back, grounding himself in the only constant he had left. "We're going to burn this whole thing wide open, boy, whatever it takes." And in the silence of that chamber, with unseen eyes still watching, the promise felt less like hope and more like war. The chamber reeked of damp paper and rust, but Ryan barely noticed the smell anymore. His flashlight shook in his grip as the beam swept across the table of photographs. Rows of teenagers stared back at him, frozen in time, some faces faded, some crossed out with thick black ink, and then at the far end, Emily Carter's photo. Fresh, current, not just found. It had been placed here, deliberately, as if to prove she belonged to the same story that had haunted Maple Ridge for decades. Shadow growled low, pacing circles around the table. His tail was stiff, ears forward, body vibrating with restrained fury. Ryan pressed a hand against the shepherd's back. "Easy, boy. We've got what we need." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. This wasn't the end of a trail. It was the middle of a maze. Patel swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "Sir, are you seeing this? These files go back years, decades." Ryan picked up one of the folders, its cardboard cover soft with age. Inside were attendance records, disciplinary notes, but scribbled in the margins were phrases that chilled him. "Remove quietly. No further contact. Record sealed." He flipped another folder open. Different year, different student, the same notes. And beneath one entry, a word underlined twice. Witness. Ryan's stomach turned. This wasn't sloppy paperwork. This was a system. "Get these photographed," Ryan ordered, forcing steel into his voice. "Every file, every note. If someone tries to bury this again, we'll make sure it survives." Patel nodded, fumbling with his phone. But Shadow didn't stop pacing. He circled once more, then froze, nose pressed against the far wall. He whined, then barked sharply. Ryan swung the light. The wall looked ordinary, cinder block like the others. But Shadow's nose dragged over one section repeatedly, his claws scraping against it. "Another hollow," Ryan murmured. He tapped it with his knuckles. The echo confirmed it. Patel paled. "How many of these rooms are there?" Ryan exhaled. "Too many." Before they could investigate further, a sound echoed through the tunnels. A metallic clang. Then another. Shadow stiffened, body rigid, ears tracking the noise. Someone else was down here. Ryan killed the flashlight. The chamber plunged into darkness, the air suddenly suffocating. Only the faint glow of the red camera light blinked above them. Shadow's growl rumbled deep, steady, like a warning drumbeat. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. Patel's whisper shook. "Sir." Ryan raised his weapon, voice a whisper sharp as glass. "Quiet. Follow Shadow." The shepherd moved first, gliding toward the chamber entrance, nose low but silent. Ryan followed, every muscle taut, flashlight clipped off to avoid giving away their position. The footsteps grew louder behind them, echoing to the tunnels like the approach of something inhuman. Ryan's instinct screamed to turn and fire, but Shadow pressed on, tugging them down a side corridor. His nose locked on something Ryan couldn't sense but trusted without question. They slipped through a narrow passage and crouched behind a stack of broken furniture. The footsteps entered the chamber they had just left. Voices followed. 2 men. Ryan strained to hear. "Told you he's getting too close." Doesn't matter. We move the rest of the night. She was never supposed to. The voice cut off. A long silence. Then, louder, one of them laughed. Doesn't matter. He's already in the dark with us. We'll find him. Ryan's hand tightened on his weapon. His pulse thundered, but he forced himself to stay still. Shadow leaned against his leg, a living anchor, his growl low but controlled. The footsteps faded down another corridor. Patel exhaled shakily. They knew we were here. Ryan's jaw clenched. They've known all along. Once the silence returned, Shadow tugged forward again. He led them through winding passages until they reached another staircase, this one narrow and steep. At the top, Ryan shoved a rusted door open and found himself back in the east wing of the school. The morning sun had risen higher now, streaming through broken blinds, making the hallways glow dust gold. But something was wrong. The officers posted at the entrance were gone. Radios lay abandoned on the floor, static hissing through them. Patel's face drained. Where the hell is everyone? Ryan bent to pick up one of the radios. The casing was cracked, like it had been stomped. His guts sank. Shadow barked once, sharply, and darted down the hall. Shadow, wait. Ryan sprinted after him, Patel close behind. The shepherd skidded to a stop outside the nurse's office, nose pressed to the doorframe. He barked, then pawed furiously at the handle. Ryan flung the door open. Inside, chaos. Medical cabinets overturned, papers strewn across the floor, and on the wall, scrawled in fresh black paint, "Stop looking." For the first time in years, fear threatened to choke Ryan. Whoever they were up against wasn't just hiding evidence. They were sending messages, personal messages. Shadow barked again, jolting him back. The shepherd stood over something on the floor, a torn piece of fabric. Blue, police issued. Patel whispered, "That's from one of ours." Ryan's throat tightened. They weren't just dealing with outsiders. Someone inside the department could be compromised. He pocketed the fabric, jaw set. "We don't stop. Not now." Shadow barked, sharp and insistent, then bolted toward the stairwell. His body language was urgent, almost frantic. Ryan followed, lungs burning as they climbed. The stairwell opened into the school library, a cavernous room lined with dust-covered shelves. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting fractured beams across the floor. And in the center of the room, waiting like a stage scene, sat another table. On it, more photographs. But these weren't of students. They were police. Ryan's own face stared back at him from one of the prints. The silence that followed was deafening. Patel gasped. Shadow barked furiously, hackles raised, teeth bared at the table. Ryan's hands trembled as he picked up the photo. His image was circled in red ink. Patel stammered, "Sir, what does this mean?" Ryan's voice was flat, controlled only by sheer will. "It means this isn't just about missing kids. They're watching us. They're watching me." Shadow pressed his body against Ryan's leg, grounding him. The shepherd's growl rolled steady, his eyes locked on the shadows between the shelves. Ryan forced a breath. "This goes deeper than I thought. And if they're watching us, they already know we found Emily." Patel's voice cracked. "Then she's still in danger." Ryan looked down at Shadow, the only partner he trusted completely. Not while he's on the trail. As they prepared to leave, a crash echoed from the far end of the library, shelves toppling like dominoes. Shadow lunged forward, barking furiously, dragging Ryan into a sprint. They rounded the corner just as a figure slipped through a side exit, shadowed by sunlight. Ryan sprinted after them, but by the time he burst into the hallway, the figure was gone. Only a single item remained, dropped deliberately in the middle of the floor. A school ID badge. Not Emily's, not Hannah Rivers, but another girl's. Date, 1978. Name, crossed out. Ryan's breath caught. He didn't know whether it was a warning or a breadcrumb. But Shadow barked, pawing at the badge, tail stiff. The shepherd knew what it meant. The trail wasn't over. It had only widened. Ryan pocketed the badge, his voice grim. "All right, boy. They think they can scare us off. They think we'll back down." Shadow barked once sharp, eyes blazing. Ryan looked at Patel, whose face was pale but resolute. We're not just hunting a kidnapper anymore. We're unraveling an entire system. The library seemed to grow colder as the words settled. Ryan pressed his palm against Shadow's harness, steadying himself against the one thing in the room that still felt certain. "Lead the way, boy," he whispered. "Wherever this ends, we'll face it together." And as Shadow tugged toward the next hallway, claws striking against the tile with furious determination, Ryan realized the truth. They weren't chasing shadows. They were dragging them into the light. Ryan Hale had seen his share of twisted cases, but never one that wrapped its claws so tightly around the place he called home. Maple Ridge wasn't just a town anymore. It was a stage, and someone had been pulling the strings for decades. The table of photographs in the library still haunted him, but there was no time to dwell. The dropped school ID badge, dated 1978, burned in his pocket like a live coal. Whoever left it wanted him to know this didn't start with Emily. It started long before. Shadow paced in front of the door, tail stiff, body thrumming with energy. His eyes stayed fixed on the hallway beyond, as if he already knew where the trail led next. Ryan straightened, tucking the badge into an evidence bag. "All right, boy, take us home." The shepherd barked once, sharp and unrelenting. They followed Shadow through the east wing, past classrooms scarred by graffiti, past lockers that stood untouched for years. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the smell of dust and gasoline clinging to every breath. At the far end of the hall, Shadow stopped at a set of double doors. The faded lettering above read auditorium. Patel frowned. "This hasn't been used in years." Ryan's jaw tightened, which makes it perfect. He pushed the doors open. Inside, the auditorium yawned wide, seats coated in dust, stage curtains moth-eaten and sagging. But the space wasn't empty. Floodlights had been dragged inside, wired crudely to generators. And on the stage sat another table. Not files this time. Not photos. Maps. Blueprints. The entire layout of Maple Ridge High spread across the wood. Every vent, every tunnel, every hidden chamber marked in red. Patel muttered, "They know this place better than we ever did." Ryan's stomach turned. This wasn't just improvisation. This was a design. Shadow leapt onto the stage, nose brushing over blueprints. His paw landed squarely on a shaded square labeled sub-basement chamber. Ryan's breath caught. One more level down. They found the entrance behind the stage, concealed by plywood panels. Shadow dug furiously, barking until the officers pried it open. The stairwell beyond plunged deeper than any they'd seen. The air was thick, heavy, almost wet. Every step creaked like a warning. Shadow moved steadily, nose locked on a scent that grew stronger with every foot. His body was rigid, focused, but his eyes flicked back often to Ryan, as though checking that his partner was still there. Ryan whispered, "I'm right behind you, boy." At the bottom, the chamber opened wide, and this time it wasn't empty. Rows of metal chairs lined the walls, some bolted down, others overturned. Chains dangled from hooks in the ceiling, rattling softly in the draft. The smell of gasoline was stronger here, laced with the stench of mildew and rot. But what froze Ryan wasn't the furniture. It was the wall opposite him. Dozens of photographs taped in neat rows. Students, police, teachers, generations of Maple Ridge. Some faces crossed out, others circled, a few marked with dates. And there, in the center, a photograph of Ryan himself. Circled, Ryan's throat tightened. Shadow snarled, teeth bared, body trembling with fury. From the shadows of the far end of the chamber, a voice drifted. "You were never supposed to find this." A man stepped forward, his face obscured by the brim of a cap, jacket dark and dusty. He moved with the calm of someone who had been here many times before. Ryan raised his weapon. "Who are you?" The man chuckled. "Names don't matter. What matters is you've dug too deep. Emily saw something she shouldn't have. And now so have you." Shadow's growl deepened, filling the chamber. Ryan's voice hardened. "She's alive. We got to her first. Whatever you were planning, it's over." The man shook his head slowly. "Alive for now. But she isn't the first. And she won't be the last. This town thrives on forgetting, on silence. You think dragging her out changes anything. Ryan's grip tightened. It changes everything. The man smirked. We'll see. Before Ryan could react, the man slipped back into the tunnels. Shadow lunged forward, barking, straining against the leash. Ryan hesitated for only a moment before giving the command. Go! The chase ripped through the tunnels. Shadow in the lead, Ryan close behind. The shepherd's barks echoed like gunshots, guiding the way through twisting corridors. They burst into a maintenance hall, sunlight bleeding through broken windows. The man was already halfway to the exit. Ryan sprinted, lungs burning. Shadow, take him. The shepherd leapt, tackling the man to the ground with a force that rattled the floor. Teeth bared, Shadow pinned him, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Ryan closed the distance, weapon trained. It's over. The man spat dust, laughter bubbling up even now. You think I'm the only one? Ryan's jaw clenched. Maybe not, but you're the one standing in front of me. Patel and 2 officers rushed in, cuffing the man as Shadow stepped back, tail still stiff, eyes locked on him like he'd tear him apart if given the word. Hours later, the school was swarming with law enforcement. Forensics teams hauled out boxes of files, photographs, and evidence. Reporters filled the street outside, microphones hungry for answers. Emily was safe with her parents, wrapped in blankets. Shadow sitting proudly at her side, as though he'd been guarding her all his life. The shepherd barely moved except to press his head against Emily's trembling hand, grounding her in a way no words could. Ryan stood at the edge of the scene, exhaustion carving deep lines into his face. But his eyes stayed sharp, locked on the evidence men pulling away. This wasn't over. The man they caught was just one piece. The network behind him, the decades of silence, was still out there. Shadow pressed against his leg, steady and loyal. Ryan looked down at him, the corner of his mouth tugging into the first smile in days. We're not done yet, boy, but we're closer. The shepherd wagged his tail once, sharp and sure. As the sun dipped behind the town, painting Maple Ridge in orange and gold, Ryan walked Shadow through the quiet streets. For the first time since the festival, the town felt like it was breathing again. Families sat on porches, lights flickered in kitchen windows, and laughter drifted faintly through the air. Ryan knew things would never be the same. The secrets buried under Maple Ridge High would take years to unravel. But Emily was alive, and Shadow had proven, once again, that truth has a way of clawing to the surface, even through darkness. He paused at the edge of town, resting a hand on Shadow's back. You did good, partner. Better than any of us. They can lie. They can cover up, but you don't. You never look away. Shadow pressed closer, gaze steady on the horizon. And for the first time, Ryan let himself believe they'd won. Not the war, but a battle that mattered. Closing the audience. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. In a world where shadows can stretch long, sometimes it takes loyalty, instinct, and a voice that doesn't need words to bring truth into the light. What do you think? If Shadow hadn't been there that night, would Emily's story have ever been told?